storm had passed by the time Molly Crane was sent into the greenhouse. It had left the glass panels streaked and the air inside still unsettled. That particular greenhouse smell of wet soil and trapped heat, of growing things adjusting to the change in pressure. Molly carried a bucket and a cloth and wore a uniform that fit her the way borrowed things fit. Adequately, but not for her. A guard at the entrance looked her over. "Careful," he said. "Some of these plants are worth more than you." She did not answer. She stepped inside and smelled the soil. Something was wrong, not obviously wrong. Not wrong in the way of rot or neglect. Wrong in the way of something carefully managed that had started to fail at the edges. The soil smelled warm. Not warm the way greenhouse soil should smell after a storm, that clean mineral heat of evaporation and root activity. Warm in a deeper way, as if the heat were coming from below rather than from above. Molly moved down the first row. She paused at the black orchids. The leaves were wilting along the outer edges, not the slow, gradual wilting of a plant that needed water, but the sudden, heavy wilting of a plant whose roots were being cooked from beneath. She had seen this once on the farm, when a heating pipe under a seedling bed had failed and started running too hot. The plants had wilted in exactly this way. She crouched and looked at the underside of the lowest leaves. Condensation, not on the top, where the misters would have left moisture. She had checked the misters, and they had run 40 minutes early, which was itself wrong, but the droplets on the top surface were consistent with that. What was on the bottom was different, fine, uniform droplets arranged in a pattern that matched warm air meeting a cool surface, not air from a malfunctioning mist head. Air from below. Rising air, warm enough to condense on contact with the underside of a leaf that was cooler than the air beneath it, which meant the heat was coming from underground. The misting system activated. She looked at the clock on the far wall. It was running 40 minutes ahead of schedule. She had noticed on her first morning that the overnight guard, Orrin Hale, was the only member of the security rotation who never complained about the early misting runs. Every other guard mentioned it. Orrin simply moved through the orchid section without looking at the flowers, without checking the clock, without pausing, as if he already knew it was coming. She moved to the edge of a large planting trough and laid her palm flat on the ceramic side. Warm, more than warm. Hot enough that she held her hand there only a few seconds before pulling it back. She crouched lower and looked under the trough's lip. The roots of the orchids had grown down through the drainage holes and then turned sideways. They were wrapping around something metal. A grate, sealed with the specific gray-brown of old metal that had not been disturbed in a long time, except that the edge of the grate, where the roots were thickest, had a faint shine to it. Recently opened, recently closed. "What are you doing?" Dr. Selwyn stood at the end of the row. He was a thin man with the careful posture of someone who understood that authority could be expressed through stillness. He looked at Molly the way he looked at the soil, as something that either served a purpose or did not. "I was checking the condensation pattern," Molly said. "You were touching the orchids. I was looking at what the orchids are touching." Selwyn's expression did not change. "A maid's assessment of plant health is noted and disregarded," he said. "Leave the trough alone." "They are breathing wrong," Molly said. A pause. "Plants do not breathe wrong." "Miss Crane," Selwyn said. Maids simply hear what they are afraid of. Cassian Drake appeared in the doorway at the far end of the greenhouse. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the particular attention of a man who had learned to read rooms quickly because inattention had costs he did not want to pay again. He had come to check the storm damage to the glass panels. He had not come to find his newest maid in a standoff with his head botanist over the respiratory habits of his orchids. He stood very still and looked at the two of them. Selwyn's posture said, "This is a misunderstanding that I have already corrected." Molly's posture said, "I have not finished yet." He looked at Selwyn. He looked at Molly. He looked at the black orchids. Molly pointed to the underside of the nearest leaf. "One of your plants," she said, "is afraid enough to sweat from underneath." Cassian crossed the greenhouse in 12 steps. He looked at the condensation on the leaf's underside. He looked at the grate. He had not known there was a grate beneath the orchid trough. Cassian had kept enemies beneath the greenhouse for 3 years. Not enemies in the simple sense. In the Mafia, the most dangerous people were not the ones you wanted dead. They were the ones whose deaths would start something you could not finish. Witnesses whose testimony, given publicly, would collapse alliances that had taken decades to build. Defectors whose knowledge was worth more as leverage than as silence. People whose continued existence was the only thing preventing a war between families who had stopped talking. Cassian kept them alive beneath the greenhouse because the greenhouse was his. The subterranean level was known only to him and his most trusted people, and alive people could be used in ways dead ones could not. The negotiation had taken 2 years to arrange. 2 years of back-channel messages and carefully worded proposals and meetings that officially had not happened in buildings that officially had no connection to either family. In 6 weeks, Cassian was scheduled to present 3 living witnesses to the Mafia Council as part of that peace negotiation with the Mercier family. The negotiation centered on a verdict from 12 years ago, a ruling that had condemned 2 Mercier capos for a killing that, according to the witnesses Cassian held, had been organized by someone else. If the witnesses testified, the verdict was overturned. The war that had run quietly between the families for over a decade could end. If the witnesses died before the council met, the Mercier faction's aggressive elements would interpret the timing as deliberate. The quiet war would become a loud one. Cassian understood this. He believed the greenhouse was safe. He believed the level below it was known only to him. He had not known there was a second level. He pulled Molly out of the greenhouse and told her to stay out of the restricted sections. She said, "You can lock me out. It will not make the roots stop wrapping around the vents." He stopped walking. He turned back. She met his gaze without moving. "I would need to know what I saw before I could decide what not to say." He looked at her. "There is a level below the greenhouse," he said. "It is secured. The people in it are alive by my decision, and they will remain alive by my decision until the council meets." "I understand," Molly said. "What you heard was one of them, moving, not escaping." "What I heard," Molly said carefully, "was a sound coming from below the trough with the black orchids, which is not where your level is." He was quiet. "You do not know where my level is. I know where the grate is," she said, "and I know your level has a separate entrance because I have seen the guards use it. The grate under the trough is not that entrance. Cassian looked at the greenhouse. He looked at Selwyn, who had remained inside with the composed stillness of a man waiting for a conversation to end in his favor. "Check the lower level," he said to Tomas. The security technician, who had been standing at a discreet distance through the entire exchange. Full count. The count came back within 20 minutes. Everyone was present. No one had moved. No one was missing. No one had been near the trough. Cassian found Molly in the corridor. "There is no one below the trough," he said. "The trough is warm," she said. "The misting system ran 40 minutes early. The condensation is on the wrong side of the leaf, and the roots have grown around a grate that is supposed to be a sealed drainage void." She paused. Drainage voids do not breathe. 3 days later, Cassian took Molly down to the level he controlled. He did this because the alternative was continuing to have a maid appear at inconvenient moments with specific observations he could not dismiss without checking, and that was a particular kind of administrative problem he did not have patience for. He also did it because he had spent 3 days quietly verifying the things she had said: the misting schedule, the condensation pattern, the temperature of the ceramic troughs, and every single thing had checked out exactly as she had described it. He did not tell her this. He simply appeared at her station at 6 in the morning and said, "Bring your notebook." He did this because it was easier to show her she was wrong than to argue with someone who kept generating new specific details. The level was functional, secured, and exactly as he had described. Steel doors, guards posted at 6-hour rotations, 7 occupied rooms, a ventilation system that ran independently of the greenhouse above, 7 people. 7 who would walk out of this room in 38 days and give testimony to a council that could end a war. Molly looked at the walls. She looked at the ceiling where the root of an orchid had pushed through a crack in the concrete and bent sideways. She had been watching roots for 3 days. Roots did not grow toward nothing. They grew toward what they needed. And this root, which should have grown downward into whatever soil it could find, had grown sideways, horizontal, deliberate, toward a wall that had nothing on the blueprints beyond it. She crossed to the wall and pressed her palm to it, warm. She looked at Cassian. "There is another room behind this. There is no room on the blueprint. Then the plants grew toward a room your blueprints forgot." Tomas pulled the original construction drawings from the estate archive. The drawings were from the era of Cassian's mother. In the corner of the greenhouse substructure, in an area labeled in old handwriting, was a notation: "Drainage void, sealed." Selwyn appeared in the doorway. He said the void had been filled in during the renovation. Molly asked why the root had grown toward it. Selwyn said roots grew toward moisture. Molly said, "Then show me the moisture source." He could not, because there was no irrigation line in that section. There was no reason for moisture unless the moisture was coming from inside. They found the entrance through the root cooling system. Mrs. Vale, who had managed the greenhouse under Cassian's mother, remembered it. She called it the lungs of the glasshouse. A mechanical water system that used pressure from the ornamental pond to circulate cool water through copper pipes beneath the planting troughs, which in turn opened ventilation doors in the subfloor when the pressure was correct. The system was old. Selwyn had told Cassian it had been decommissioned. He had told Cassian this because it was still running, just not for the greenhouse. The access point was behind the pond filter housing, a hatch that opened onto a second staircase, narrower than the first, lined with copper pipe. Cassian, Molly, and Tomas went down. The chamber was small. It had been designed to store seeds, temperature-controlled, humidity-stable, separated from the main building systems by double walls. It still functioned as designed, just not for seeds. The man inside was seated on a folding cot, with the specific stillness of someone who had learned that stillness cost less energy than movement. He was thin. His skin had the particular pallor of years without direct sunlight. His hands rested on his knees with a patience that looked practiced rather than natural. He looked at Cassian. He said, "You built a prison above me and never knew I was the prisoner beneath it." Cassian did not move. The man's name was Elias Ward. 6 years ago, Cassian had been told Elias died in a warehouse fire. He had believed it. He had arranged a memorial and redistributed Elias's responsibilities and continued operating as if the loss had been absorbed. And for 6 years, Elias had been breathing recycled air 12 feet below his greenhouse floor. On the speaker system above them, Selwyn's voice came through the greenhouse intercom. "You should have left the plants alone." Elias talked for a long time, and Cassian listened in the way people listen when they are hearing something they already half knew and did not want confirmed. The chamber had been built to last. A ventilation shaft ran up through the root system of the black orchids. Water came from the old irrigation line Selwyn had rerouted through the pond system. A man named Orrin Hale, a guard Cassian trusted with the overnight greenhouse rotation, brought food and medication twice a week through the maintenance channel. Orrin had been doing this for 6 years. His access logs showed normal patrol activity. His schedule aligned with the misting runs that ran before his shifts, runs that Selwyn had programmed to equalize the humidity changes Orrin's work created below. No one had checked the misting logs against the patrol logs because no one had reason to. Waste left through the original agricultural drainage line. The misting system ran early to equalize humidity when Orrin's visits added warmth and moisture to the chamber. The fertilizer runs in the orchid section masked the chemical traces from the medication. Selwyn had built a life support system inside a garden and told everyone the pipes were decorative. Elias had been kept alive not out of mercy, but out of necessity. He had been present when Cassian's mother discovered that Selwyn was routing information through rare seed imports, using plant shipments and cultivation records as a cover for transactions that moved between families the Drakes were not supposed to be talking to. Elias had prepared documentation. They had planned to present it to the council together. Then Cassian's mother had died. Selwyn had filed a report attributing her death to complications from a condition she had managed for years. He had also filed a secondary document, this one reaching the Mercier family through intermediaries, suggesting that the complications had been accelerated. Cassian had gone to war based on that document. 12 years of grievance and retaliation, and men dying on both sides. And the origin point was a document Selwyn had written because a woman had been about to expose him. The peace negotiation Cassian was preparing. The witnesses he was keeping alive beneath his greenhouse. The verdict that, overturned, would establish that the Roe Mercier capos had been condemned for something they had not done. All of it, the framework, the timing, the argument Cassian planned to make before the council, rested on documents and testimony that existed within a larger structure Selwyn had built. A structure designed to keep Selwyn's original crime invisible. The war had never been about what Cassian thought it was about. It had been about Selwyn needing it to continue long enough that no one looked too carefully at how it had started. Elias was the only person alive who could say clearly and specifically what that foundation was made of. If he dies, Cassian said quietly, to no one in particular, the truth dies with him. Molly said nothing. She was listening to the greenhouse. The misting system had gone quiet. The ventilation had changed. The air in the chamber was becoming heavier. Cassian stood beside Molly in the greenhouse corridor above and watched the temperature gauge on the wall climb past 32 degrees. He said, "You had no reason to come back after the first day. The orchids were still wrong. Most people would have let that be Selwyn's problem. Most people had not grown up watching a farm go wrong because one heating pipe ran too hot for 3 weeks," Molly said. "The plants tell you. You have to be willing to hear it." He was quiet. "I am not good at hearing things I do not already know," he said. She looked at him. It was the most honest thing she had heard him say. "I know," she said. "That is why Selwyn was able to run a logistics operation under your greenhouse for 6 years. The heat above the orchid troughs had pushed past 35 degrees. Cassian looked at her. "If we live through this," he said, "you will teach me how to listen." Molly looked at the wilting leaves. "If we live through this," she said, "you will stop locking people out of rooms that breathe." It was not a gentle observation. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things that were accurate and uncomfortable, without visible reaction, but also without argument. The intercom crackled. Selwyn spoke through it in a voice that had stopped performing composure. "Your mother built this place to breathe. You filled its lungs with prisoners," Cassian said, "and you filled its roots with lies." The temperature rose. Selwyn had cut the electronic control system. The doors locked. The primary ventilation closed. The heated mist system, the one designed to sterilize the glass panels and soil trays, activated at full output. It was not a killing mechanism. Not immediately. Selwyn had loaded the old sterilization cycle with sedative vapor instead of cleaning chemicals. Dispersed through sealed air in increasing heat, it would make a person slow, then confused, then unconscious, and the chamber below, which depended on the greenhouse's mechanical lungs for its air supply, had no independent oxygen line. Tomas tried the control panel. The electronics were locked from the server Selwyn controlled. One of the guards put his shoulder against the main door. It did not move. Cassian said, "The wall. If we go through the wall into the adjacent level," Molly said, "break the wrong wall and you will bury the only man who can tell you the truth." The concrete between the chamber and the main level was structural. Breaking it without knowing exactly where would collapse the ceiling. Cassian looked at her. "Then what?" She was already moving toward the copper pipes on the wall. From the intercom, Selwyn's voice, "Maids do not understand architecture, Miss Crane." Molly said, "No, but I can water what you forgot was alive, Mrs." Vale's voice came through on the secondary radio, the backup channel that ran on a separate battery. When the glass house chokes, drown the roots and the old lungs open. Molly understood. She moved to the pond access valve. The root-cooling lung system worked on pressure. Water from the ornamental pond, pushed through copper pipes by a simple mechanical pump, ran beneath the planting troughs and released through vents when the pressure reached a threshold. When the vents opened, cool air was drawn down from outside and warm air was pushed up. The system had kept the greenhouse cool before electricity existed. It could do it again. But the sequence mattered. Open the wrong valve in the wrong order, and the pipes would rupture, or the chamber below would flood, cool the roots, and the old system would pull fresh air through the chamber. In this greenhouse, water did not only feed the plants, it moved air under them. Molly needed 3 valves in the right order. The first was the pond inlet, a large wheel valve half buried in the filter housing beside the ornamental pool. She knelt in the wet gravel and turned it. The resistance was decades of disuse. She used both hands and her full weight. The valve moved. Water pushed into the copper network. She heard it, a low resonant hum in the pipes, building toward the troughs above. "Van 1," she said quietly. "Pressure building." The black orchids shivered. She moved to the second valve. This one controlled the distribution to the orchid section, the one above the chamber's ventilation shaft. When cool water ran under the orchid trough, the soil temperature would drop. The warm air sitting in the chamber would be drawn upward. Fresh air would follow. She opened it. The orchid trough above them creaked. The roots that had been wrapped around the grate for years tightened as the water pressure changed below them. Then, slowly, the grate shifted. Not much, but enough. A breath of cooler air moved through the chamber. Elias, who had been sitting very still for the past several minutes, took one deliberate breath. Molly did not stop. The third valve was in the carnivorous plant section. The pressure relief that prevented the system from overfilling and sending water into places water should not go. The handle had roots wrapped around it, thick ones. The plants in this section had been growing for years toward every available source of moisture, and the valve had been the most reliable one. She could not force it. She knelt and began working her way through the secondary root structure with the gardening shears she still had in her apron pocket. She did not cut the main roots. Carnivorous plants were already under stress from the elevated temperature and the sedative compounds in the mist. Cutting a primary root in these conditions would send the plant into rapid decline. More importantly, a large root system in sudden distress would contract, and if the contracted roots pulled against the valve mechanism, the mechanism would fail. She cleared the secondary growth. The smaller tendrils that had wound around the handle, without providing the plant any structural benefit. She worked from the outside in, freeing the handle millimeter by millimeter. The mist above her had thickened. Her hands were steady, but her thinking had that particular underwater quality of a person working at the edge of what their body would allow. It took 4 minutes. The air was thicker by then. Her thinking had slowed in the edges, the specific cognitive softening that came from elevated CO2 and sedative compounds. She kept her movements deliberate, one root at a time. When the handle was clear, she turned it, and the pressure dropped. The system stabilized. She moved to the fourth valve, the recirculation line under the tropical section. which would create the convective loop that would pull fresh air through the full ventilation network. Cassian was already there. He had watched her open the first 3. He did not ask what she needed. He moved the large planting urn that was sitting directly on top of the access panel. He moved it because she needed it moved, not because he had been asked, not because he had evaluated the request, because she was working and the thing in her way needed to be somewhere else. She opened the 4th valve. The system completed its circuit. Water ran under the tropical section, up through Lotus's chamber, back through the orchids, and down again through the pressure relief. The vents in the chamber floor opened with a sound like a slow exhale. Cold air pushed through from outside, from the underground air exchange that had been sealed for decades and had just been forced open by enough water pressure to make the old pipes groan. Elias coughed. The cough was deep and prolonged, the kind that comes when lungs that have been working too hard suddenly have what they need. Above them, the orchids straightened. The condensation on their undersides began to clear. The temperature in the greenhouse dropped 4 degrees in 7 minutes. The plants were breathing easier. Orrin Hale was found at the maintenance entrance with the chamber access records in his bag. He had been preparing to leave before the evening lock cycle. Selwyn was in the fertilizer storage area. He had a second key to the external gate and had been moving toward it when the greenhouse's mechanical system, which he had declared decommissioned, had begun making sounds he recognized. He understood then that the old system was running. He understood what that meant. He turned back. He moved to the misting control panel at the rear of the storage room and began pulling the logs, the scheduling records that showed every early run, every humidity adjustment, every deviation from the standard cycle for the past 6 years. Cassian's people reached him before the last folder left the shelf. He stopped moving then. He stood in the storage area, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent 30 years believing he was the only person who understood something precious, and has just watched someone else prove him wrong in 40 minutes using a bucket and a set of garden shears. He did not look defeated. He looked like a man who had confused devotion to a place with ownership of it. The storage area held more than fertilizer. Behind a false section of shelving, installed, the records showed, in the same renovation that was supposed to have sealed the drainage void, were a series of document cases, seed import records used to route payments, correspondence with intermediaries who had passed information to the Roe Mercier faction. A copy of the report on Cassian's mother's death, annotated in Selwyn's handwriting, and the original document that had started the war. Cassian read these things for a long time. Selwyn said nothing. "The plants recorded what you did," Molly said. Selwyn looked at her, the misting schedule, the soil temperature, the root patterns, the grate under the orchid trough that was opened and closed on a cycle no orchid required. She looked at the shelving unit. "The garden kept your schedule. You just didn't think anyone would read it." Cassian set down the folder. He looked at Selwyn. "You will go before the council," he said, "not as a witness. As a subject of testimony," Selwyn said. "The council will not believe a maid found this." "The council," Cassian said, "will believe the documentation. The maid is why I had a reason to look." Elias was brought out of the chamber on a stretcher. He was not strong enough to walk without assistance. He would need weeks before he could testify. The 7 witnesses from the first subterranean level were transferred to neutral custody that same night. Cassian did not call it protection. He did not call the first level safe again until the council had reviewed each case individually, who was free to leave, who had asked to remain hidden, and who had never been given the choice. But before they carried him through the greenhouse, he said something to Cassian. "Your mother did not build this place to hide enemies. She built it so living things would have air." Cassian looked at the greenhouse, at the orchids that had straightened, at the mist that was clearing, at the warm glass panels where light was moving through water vapor and becoming color. He did not answer Elias, but he looked at Molly. "I thought this place obeyed me," he said quietly. "Living things do not obey," she said. "They respond." He held that for a moment, and she understood that he understood. Cassian gave Molly a key. 2 weeks later, he gave it to her in the greenhouse, in front of Mrs. Vale and 3 members of the household staff. Not a symbolic key, the key to the pond valve system, the one that operated the root-cooling lungs. "If this house breathes wrong again," he said, "I want you to be the first to hear it." Molly held the key. She did not take it immediately. "Then no one laughs when a maid says the soil is warm." Cassian looked at the staff. "No one laughs." She took the key. From that day on, no misting schedule, valve repair, quarantine order, or sealed trough in the greenhouse could be approved without Molly Crane's signature. She put the key in her pocket and picked up her notebook and began writing down the misting schedule for the week. Cassian watched her for a moment. Then he asked, "What do they say today?" She ran her palm along the side of the black orchid trough. She felt the temperature. She checked the underside of the nearest leaf. She looked at the clock, and then at the automatic misting controls. "They are breathing easier," she said. He stayed a moment longer than he needed to. Neither of them marked it as significant. Both of them knew it was. Cassian Drake had hidden his enemies beneath the greenhouse because he believed roots made better walls than stone. But the secret that almost destroyed him was not in the prison he built. It was in the chamber he never knew existed. And the only person who heard it was the maid who listened when the plants began to breathe wrong. Was Cassian wrong for building a prison beneath his mother's greenhouse? Or did Molly prove the real danger was trusting the man who made that prison breathe? Share your answer below and subscribe to Mafia Hearts and Secrets for more dangerous romances hidden inside the underworld's most powerful families.